Well, the summer is upon us, and if you haven't traveled yet, chances are that some of you will travel, get some time away. Pastor Carter is away. I will travel on Tuesday, and I will be gone for about 4 Sundays. And we're going to see family, and we're going to be with friends in Brazil, and have the opportunity to get some good time to refresh and to recharge, so that we can come back to the fall season of ministry. And if you are going to travel like I am about to travel, I'm sure you have booked your Airbnbs. How many of you have Airbnbs booked for the summer? I have a few. And I was thinking about Airbnbs as I was preparing this sermon, as we launched this series of sermons entitled Homecoming. Imagine that you arrive at your Airbnb that you have booked months ago, and you get there and you notice that the rooms do not look like the pictures that you saw on the website. And you're now disappointed because the furniture is kind of weird, it has stains, there's some smells. And you spend one night there. By the way, that has happened to me several times. The second day, you're very uncomfortable with it. And imagine if I looked at my wife and says, I mean, we're going to be here for the next couple of weeks. I can't stay in a place like this. And I would go to the home goods store next to it, and I would buy paintings and furniture pieces, and I would bring it back and start hanging paintings and changing the furniture around, and I don't like this rug, and replace the rug. If I did that, if any one of us did that, that would be crazy, right? Like, who would do something that stupid? And unless you have an endless supply of cash, you probably wouldn't do this. I would assume that celebrities may do that. When they get the hotel rooms that they don't like, they will refurnish for a couple weeks. But the normal average human being would never do that, because you know that you're just going to stay there temporarily. And you just learn how to get used to the rooms and the environment. Maybe you leave a bad review on your way out, but that's what you do. No one would do that. And I was thinking about that because, as ridiculous and stupid as that sounds, that's how we treat this life. We are not in this world permanently. And yet we try to make a world that is not home by adding comforts and attaching to things that we should not be attached to. See, I believe that we as humans do not know how to live in the in-between spaces, the transitional spaces of life. This series that we're going to go throughout the weeks of the summer is a series that addresses this big theme in the Bible. In fact, we're going to go through the whole Bible in the span of about 10 weeks. It's this theme of homelessness and homecoming, of how all we know about this life is that this world is not how it's supposed to be. We go through life sensing a lack of belonging and looking for home. And my hope throughout the series, as you go through these series of sermons, as you keep coming back, is that you would acknowledge where that lack of belonging comes from, and that you would maybe find the hope of encountering home, knowing that God not only wants you to come home, but He has provided a way to bring you home. And as we start our journey, we go to the book of Genesis, which is the first book of the Bible, where we find the explanation for why we feel this way and why life is that way and why we don't know how to live well within the tension of homelessness and homecoming. We're going to read from chapter 3, verses 22 to 24, and I will refer to the rest of the verses of this chapter as we go through the sermon. But I want you to get a little bit of context. So chapter 1 and chapter 2 of Genesis give us the creation account. It explains the origin of things, of a God that created a world in 6 days, and on the sixth day, he creates humanity, and he puts humanity in the middle of this beautiful world, which is actually called a garden. And he allows them to delight in all the wonderful things that he has created. And for a season, Adam and Eve, our forefathers, are able to live within the bounds that God has given them. God had said to them also in the first 2 chapters that they could eat of every fruit, they can enjoy anything in the garden, but they should not touch the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And in one particular day, they are tempted by the serpent, and they end up disobeying God and eating that fruit, and everything goes wild after that. That's where we find ourselves in chapter 3. God brings them into account, and these are the consequences for their sin. Verse 22, then the Lord God said, behold, the man has become like one of us in knowing good and evil. Now lest he reach out his hand and take also the tree of life and eat and live forever. Therefore the Lord God sent him out of the Garden of Eden to work the ground from which he was taken. And he drove out the man, and at the east of the Garden of Eden he placed the cherubim and a flaming sword that turned every way to guard the way to the tree of life. This is the word of the Lord. There's 3 main pieces of truth that we learn from this passage that we just read that explains why we feel the way that we do, why life is the way that it is. The first one is that we have been evicted from home. Every single one of us here lives life under this reality that we are no longer home. In fact, the title of the sermon is Eviction Notice. Secondly, we also learn that we are all in pursuit of home. We've been evicted from home, 1, but we're all in pursuit of home. But then 3, there is an element of hope, which is that we can be brought home. God has provided a way to bring us back home. But before we get to the last part of the sermon, which is the part that is designed to encourage you tonight, we must come to grips with the truth that we have been evicted from home. In verse 23, the first word is therefore. Therefore, the Lord God sent him out, meaning Adam, out from the Garden of Eden to work the ground from which he was taken. Every time in the Bible that you find the word therefore, there is now the explanation of what has been taught and what has been told to us in the previous section. So here, verse 23 starts with God kicking Adam and consequently Eve out of the garden. But what is the explanation for that? Why is God kicking Adam and Eve out of the garden? It's like somebody comes to you tonight with tears in their eyes. Tears just don't show up in people's eyes. There's an explanation why tears are in their eyes. Why are you crying? Why have you been kicked out of the garden? The explanation is in verses 1 through 22. They disobeyed God. Instead of living with God as their master and Lord in the environment that God had created for them, Adam and Eve had now made a deliberate choice of becoming their own masters and lords. Instead of living within the house that God had designed for them to delight and to enjoy and to flourish, they decided now to build their own home. They decided to pursue happiness apart from God. They decided to pursue a dream of their own, not the dream that God had for them. And God did what he always does whenever we decide to do things our way. He said to them, "Is that your desire? Then go live out your desire." C.S. Lewis used to say this, that no one that is in hell because they didn't want to. They wanted a life apart from God, and so God always says, have it your way. And by the way, that's the worst thing that God can do to any one of us, is to give ourselves to our own desires. And that's what God does to Adam and Eve. So when you read this passage, it says, has God gone too far? Why is God being so mean? After all, they just ate a fruit. Well, God is saying, hey, if that's what you want, then have it your way. Beneath the disobedience is a desire to live a life in independence from God. So you want to live away from me? Then go live away from me. And since that day, humanity has lived with this sense of nostalgia. There's this Christian writer, a woman by the name of Eva Hoffman, that in reflecting upon this part of the Bible, she writes this. This is a quote from Eva Hoffman. Since Adam and Eve left the garden, is there anyone that doesn't feel like an exile? We are ejected from our authentic self, an ideal sense of belonging, attuning to ourselves and others eludes us. You're saying, why is it that we feel that we don't belong at times? It goes back to what happened in the Garden of Eden. Now, some of you know my story. Some of you may not know my story. But I grew in between cultures. This week I was looking at a picture that my mom gave me this past week and actually posted on my Instagram stories. It's a picture when I first came to the United States. My parents moved to Philadelphia in 1978, and there's a picture with me and my mom and my dad buried in the deep snow of Philadelphia. And I was looking at that picture, and I was trying to see if I could remember anything, from those days. And then I couldn't remember anything. But that's when I first came. And I pretty much lived in the United States till my last year of elementary school. My parents could not take the cold of Philadelphia, so they ended up moving to Atlanta, Georgia. And I lived in Atlanta, Georgia until I was 11 years of age. We moved back to Brazil. I attended middle school and high school in Brazil. In my senior year of high school, I met an American girl from the South by the name of Beth, who is now my wife. And we moved to Charlotte, North Carolina. We were there for about 5 years. We got married, then we moved back down to Brazil where we planted a church. We were there for 5 years, and we've been in Miami since 2008. And when I think about my life and all those years going back and forth, I never felt completely at home. I read a book entitled Third Cultured Kids. I don't know if you've ever read this book. And I completely identified myself with the writings of that book. That expresses and describes well my reality of growing in between cultures. See, when I lived in Atlanta, it was an odd experience for me in my elementary school in the neighborhood of Decatur. There were either black kids or white kids. I was the only brown kid, and I felt always displaced. And when I moved back to middle school and high school in Brazil, I felt too Americanized. In fact, my peers called me the gringo boy. Then after I met my wife and moved to Charlotte, into the deep South, I felt displaced there. I felt like I was in exile. And when I finally arrived in Miami in 2008, I said to myself, I did not know that you have ever existed. How can there be a place like this? I loved being in Miami, and I love Miami. I love being here because it seems like all the people here share my story of living in between cultures, growing in between cultures. So it's almost like we all live in this twilight zone, right? In this in-between space here. But even in a city such as this that I love and identify with the stories of the people in the city, this is a city where almost 60% of the people that live here in Miami-Dade are foreign-born, that I feel at home, I still feel like an exile and that I don't belong at times. When the cost of living starts to go up, I feel like I don't belong. When I have to face the 5 o'clock traffic on US 1, I feel I was not made for this place. And you know what I'm talking about, because some of you are transplants, some of you came from other places in the country, and there are elements of life in the city, which is a wonderful city, but there's still elements that make you feel completely like an outsider. And that's the experience of all of life. Even in the best marriages, and I have a great marriage. My wife and I have been married for now 24 years. And even in the best marriages, there are moments that you feel like you don't know the other person. There are crises that happens that makes you feel that you don't belong. You feel displaced. Even if you are to find your dream job, there are moments where you feel that you're not at home. That you don't connect with a specific team, that there are some elements in that company's culture that just doesn't vibe well with you. That's how life in this world is. And we must not just acknowledge this, but we must be comfortable with living in the tension and accept that that is the case. This world is not home. Since Adam and Eve have left the garden to wander, so have we. And that leads us obviously to the second point, that since we have left the garden with our forefathers, we have lived our lives in this journey in pursuit of home. What are we all doing? We are in pursuit of home. This world is not home, but you're trying to make it home, like buying furniture for an Airbnb. In verse 7, there's a description of how Adam and Eve felt right after they acknowledged that they had disobeyed God, that they had done exactly what God had asked them not to do. And I think that this verse is an amazing verse in Scripture because it shows us the condition of their heart. So if you go to verse 7, I'm actually in chapter 4, but if you go in chapter 3, verse 7, you would read this, that this is how they felt. When their eyes were both open, they knew that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves loincloths. Now when God created Adam and Eve and placed them in the garden, God did not create them with coverings. God did not create them and create clothes. God just created them. So they lived completely naked in the garden. And here, for the very first time, they notice that they are naked after having disobeyed God. And to me, that is an amazing statement if you really think about it, because they were still in the garden. They hadn't been kicked out yet. They're only kicked out in verse 23, right? So they're in the garden that they were created to live in. They were made from the ground. They're one with that place. And for the very first time, they feel inadequate at home, in their own place. They have a sense of inadequacy. Have you ever felt that way? You've gone to a restaurant, to a party, to a meeting, and you felt inadequate. You've either felt overly dressed or underdressed. Or here in Miami, the chances are that you will go and someone will make a comment about what you're wearing when you realize that your fashion is about 10 years old. Oh, I love this shirt. It's so 2000s. And you're like, oh my gosh, you feel completely inadequate, right? That's how they felt. They felt displaced at home, which means this, that homelessness really is a condition of the heart more than anything else. It's an issue of the heart. And what do? As a result of that, we read it in verse 7. They decide to sew clothes for themselves. They're basically standing in the garden, and they're looking at all the trees. They see an apple tree. I'm imagining here, okay? It's kind of like the Chosen type of thing. They see an apple tree. They see a vine. They see a fig leaf. They're like, we can't cover ourselves with apple tree leaves, too small. Can't cover ourselves with grape leaves. But they see the fig leaves. I was with Justin and Melissa and another couple from church in the Middle East a while back, and the fig leaves are huge, right? We actually have a picture of Justin, Paul, and I holding a fig leaf over this area. And I was like, oh, this does the trick. It's like big enough. That was their attempt to regain their sense of belonging while still at home. And we're doing just like them. We're trying to fix the problem as well. A few months ago, Pastor Carter and I went into this, I hope he's not listening to this, but it's not that bad of a story. We go into this pastor's meeting, and I'm wearing a polo shirt. I mean, if I'm wearing a polo shirt, I'm dressing up. You guys know me. I'm wearing slacks and a polo shirt. Man, this is, like, to me, fully dressing up. Pastor Carter is wearing, like, his T-shirt and his chain. We get there, all the pastors are wearing suits and ties. And we're, like, feeling uncomfortable, kind of inadequate. And so right in the middle of the meeting, we say to each other, I'm going to go to the bathroom. Yeah, I'm going to go to the bathroom too. And I go in one bathroom. He goes into another one. And when we come back into the room, we have both tucked in our shirts. I was like, bro, that does it. With that colorful T-shirt and the chain tucked in, you're fitting in perfectly. How ridiculous is that, right? But that's what we're doing. We're always trying to fix our sense of inadequacy, trying to regain our sense of belonging, of a world that we know no longer belong. We're either trying to fix the environment around us or we're trying to fix ourselves, trying to fix the environment. We're trying to get to the people that do life with us or work with us. Hey, you have to submit to my rules because that's how I am comfortable. What is this whole political polarization about? It's one group going to the other and saying, you live by my rules because that's how life is comfortable for me. That's what home looks like for me. We're doing the exact same thing that Adam and Eve are trying to do. To make a place that's not home, home. We're trying to fix ourselves when we can't fix the environment and force change upon others and force our ideals upon others. We say to ourselves, I must have the right looks. I must have the right image so that I will be accepted, so that I will feel adequate, so that I will belong. I must have the right set of accomplishments in order to gain that sense of belonging. I must have the right education, otherwise my family will not accept me. That's the only way that I will feel at home. I must live in the right place. You know how many people I come across here in Miami that say, I can't stay here, I gotta go. This place is not home. And what I know is this, is the problem is not really the city, it's never the places that we inhabit, it's really our hearts. Because I said to you a little while ago that homelessness is an issue of the heart, and wherever you go, you bring that sense of discomfort. This, by the way, happened in Miami several decades ago. Some of you have been here for a long time, but most of you, I would imagine, haven't been here for a long time. But about 4 or 5 decades ago, there was an influx of Cubans and South Americans that moved to the city. And the people that lived in the city became so uncomfortable with the cultural changes that the city was going through that they said, I can't stay here anymore. I'm going to move north. And there was even a joke that I've heard that was said, hey, the last one to leave, please bring the flag with them. Have you heard that? And that's why the city is the way it is. Wonderful. But the issue is our hearts. No place, no job, no romance, no image is going to give you the sense of belonging that your heart truly is after. And the most encouraging thing in this passage here is that in it we find hope. We find hope of re-entering this space that God created us to live. It's a space that He inhabits. The irony is that the further you run from God, the further you run from home. The reason why Eden was truly home was because God inhabited that place. And there's no way for you to experience home unless you experience proximity with God. And unless you experience proximity with God, all you will be doing is attempting to find home in ways that only drive you further from home. You get caught up in the tasks and the activities themselves. And it's that addiction that keeps you homeless. Did you know that 68% of homelessness is attributed to addiction? Now, there's many factors of why people end up homeless. Economic issues, social issues, racial issues. But it is true that if you don't deal with someone's addictions, even if you put them under a shelter, they will still be homeless. You can take the homeless out of the street, but you cannot take the homelessness out of their hearts. And many of us are still homeless because we are addicted to work, we're addicted to image, we're addicted to romance, and it keeps us in that state. So how can we find hope? How can we be brought home? Because what this text is telling us that we can be brought home. In the previous verses, before God kicks Adam and Eve out of the garden, He summons Adam and Eve and the serpent, and He gives them consequences based on the decision that they had made. God acknowledges that that would be the case. He says to Adam, hey, I know that you're going to try to find a sense of belonging through work. You're going to work really hard, but the ground is not going to collaborate with you. It's going to produce thorns and thistles. He looks at Eve and he says, I know that you're going to try to find a sense of belonging through romance. Your desire will be for your husband, but he will dominate you. And you guys will be trying to find a sense of belonging by trying to fight death, but in the end, death will win. But here's a promise. One day, the woman's descendant will be bitten by the serpent that had tempted you by the tree, but he will crush its head. It's in Genesis 3:16 that God opens up the possibility of return to the garden, that He had placed an angel at the door to protect the garden. God's desire is to bring us back. It's right there. It's still there. It's already there in Genesis chapter 3. The worst type of homelessness is the one that has given up on the idea of home, that has gotten used to that state. Many of you here may have gotten used to it. Or you may be in a place where you're thinking about giving up. And because of what we have here in this text and the promise that was given to Eve and to us of the one who would bring us back into the garden, bring us back into the presence of God, bring us back home, I want you not to give up hope. Don't give up hope tonight. I'm afraid that we live in a culture that has grown accustomed to homelessness. or with the lack of belonging. There was an article that came out on The Atlantic last month talking about architecture and explaining why most of the architectural drawings of condos and homes are doing away with the dining room. Did you guys see that one? This is what it says. As households and dining spaces have contracted, the number of people eating alone has grown. According to a 2015 report by the Food Marketing Institute, nearly half the time we spend eating is spent in isolation, a central factor in America's loneliness epidemic, and a correlate to a range of physical and mental health problems. What is this? We have grown accustomed with a sense of not belonging. So even when we build spaces, we don't build spaces where we can sit around a table with others, but we eliminated that. There's something profound for us to consider here. Do not grow accustomed to this lack of belonging. Re-encounter the hope. See, if you are going to return home, you have to be brought home. You can't find home by yourself. It's kind of like the story of those Chilean miners that were stranded underground after the entrance to this mine had collapsed. Remember that story? In there, even though they were seasoned miners, they didn't have the resources, they didn't have the intel, they didn't have the map of how to get themselves back into the service. They needed help from above, and that's the same thing. If we're going to return home, someone's got to usher us back in. That's what Jesus did by coming into the world. Why did Jesus come? Why did God send Jesus into the world? To bring us back home. Jesus is the one who came from Eden and entered history outside and east of Eden to bring us back into Eden. In John 14, the words of Jesus to his disciples were the following. John 14. In my Father's house are many rooms. If it were not so, would I have told you that I go to prepare a place for you? What is Jesus saying? Here's the reason why I've come, to bring you to my Father's house, and I am going to prepare a room for you. I have come to restore your sense of hominess, to usher you back, to usher your hearts back to this sense of belonging. And you know what's amazing about this statement that Jesus makes? Jesus makes this statement before his death and his resurrection. Jesus makes this statement in the Gospel of John, chapters before the chapter of the crucifixion. You know what I think happened? The crucifixion opened the way for us to come back into the garden. How so? On the cross, Jesus faced the angel at the door of the garden that we read about in verse 24. In 24, there's this angel that God places at the door of the garden with this flashing sword going in all different directions, prohibiting anyone that attempted to come into the garden to come into the garden. If they desired to come into the garden, they would have to go through the sword. And on the cross, what Jesus does is he goes under the power of the sword. On the cross, Jesus is slashed into pieces, breaking, therefore, the gate and the door, giving us full access back to the garden. It is no coincidence that when Jesus died, in the gospel accounts, the curtain in the temple that separated the holy place and the holies of holies was torn from top to bottom, meaning that now all of us have access to the holy presence of God because of the one who ushers us back in. Jesus is our way back home Jesus is the gate back home. That's why he says, I am the door. That's why he says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And no one comes back to the garden. No one comes back, or no one comes to the Father except through me. If you're here tonight and you're feeling like an exile, if you're feeling displaced, if you feel that you don't belong, if you have considered giving up on this idea of home and life altogether, there's hope for you tonight. Jesus is here, and he wants to usher you back home. He wants to restore this sense of belonging that you have been looking for your whole life in work and romance and image. He wants to give it to you, not based on your performance, on the work that you can put forth to get it, but on the work that he has done so that you can have it. And if you come through Jesus, regardless of the circumstances that you may find yourself in this life, in uncomfortable places, you can still have that sense of being home because you are with him. Let's pray.